That night, my phone buzzed. My bank account showed minus $510,000. A minute later, a message popped up. It said, "Thank you for the 800-acre ranch." I stared at the screen, frozen. That land was my husband's legacy, meant to stay in the family. How did it disappear without my signature or my consent? I called 911, but what came next shook me more than the missing money. That night, I was just about to set the kettle on when my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced over, expecting a reminder or maybe one of those endless promotional texts, but the alert made my stomach drop. Bank account, minus $510,000. I stared at it, blinking once, twice. It didn't make sense. That account was locked down tighter than my own front door. I hadn't touched it in over a year. It held emergency funds, land tax reserves, and the last bit of what Earl left behind. No one else was supposed to have access. Then came the second blow. A message flashed on the screen. "Thank you for the 800-acre ranch." My hands went cold. The ranch. Earl's family land in Nebraska. The place where he grew up branding cattle and learning to drive stick shift before he could even spell his own name right. The place we had agreed to keep under my name after his passing, so it wouldn't be lost in the confusion of blended family claims. I felt my breath snag in my throat. I called 911. Not because of the money, not exactly, but because that land was never just land. It was the last real thing tying my name to his. And now, it was gone. The dispatcher asked me if I was in danger. I said no, not the kind you can put in handcuffs. She offered to send someone anyway. I declined. Hung up. And just sat there in the dim, yellow kitchen light, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly louder than it had ever been before. What hurt wasn't just the theft. It was knowing someone close had to be involved. Someone who knew the land mattered more than the money. Someone who knew I wouldn't sell, not for any price. My son, Bradley, had been asking about the land for months. Casual at first. Conversations over coffee. "Mum, are you sure you want to keep maintaining that place?" "Mum, wouldn't it be easier if you handed it over now, while you're still around to help us understand the paperwork?" Each time I'd say I wasn't ready. Each time he'd smile, squeeze my hand and say, "Of course, no rush." Now I wondered if those smiles meant anything at all. Later that night, I went into the drawer where I kept old records and keys. I dug through folders. The title deed was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. The next morning, I went down to the bank. The manager, Sandra, who had known me for 15 years, pulled me into her office. She was gentle, but I could see the strain in her jaw. She printed out the authorization form that had released the funds and transferred the title. There was a signature. Mine. But it wasn't mine. The pen strokes were too smooth, the loop on the Y didn't hang right. I pointed it out to Sandra. She nodded, lips tight, and said they'd open an investigation. I left the bank with shaking hands and a silent scream sitting in my chest. At home, I paced. I opened my old notebooks. I checked mail from months ago. I tried to trace the timeline. When was the last time I physically saw that deed? When did Bradley last come by? When did I last leave the house for more than a few hours? It was all a blur. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window. The wind stirred the trees. For a moment, everything looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. Something had shifted, and whoever did this expected me to stay quiet. But I wasn't going to. Not this time. And for those of you listening, who think these things only happen to the naive or the wealthy, let me tell you this. Sometimes betrayal comes dressed in family smiles, And sometimes the ones you raised are the ones who believe they're entitled to everything you've got. Stay with me. There's more you need to hear. It had been a while since Bradley invited me over for dinner. When I arrived that night, Cameron greeted me at the door. Her smile was wide, practiced, and she leaned in for a hug that didn't quite touch her chest. The house smelled of rosemary chicken and new wood. They had renovated again. New countertops, new floors. Even the dining chairs were different from the last time I was there. Bradley walked out from the kitchen with 2 wine glasses in his hand. He handed one to Cameron and pulled out a chair for me at the table. I sat down quietly and watched them move around the kitchen, completely at ease in a home I had helped them secure years ago with a loan I never asked to be paid back. Dinner was warm, polite, even affectionate. Bradley asked about my knees, said Mira had called last week to ask about internships in Santa Fe. Cameron mentioned she was thinking about starting a side business, making handmade scented candles. She laughed and said, "You know, just something relaxing while I work from home." I nodded. I didn't say much. I rarely did in these gatherings anymore. Halfway through dessert, Bradley shifted the conversation. "Mum, I was thinking," he said, twirling his spoon in the dish. "About the land." I raised my eyes slowly. He continued, "I know you want to keep it for sentimental reasons, and I respect that. But I've been reading about these agricultural grants in New Mexico. Tax credits, startup assistance, even federal matching. If we plant grapes, we could start a small vineyard within 2 years. Nothing big, just family run." Cameron chimed in, "And I think it would be good for us to stay rooted. With how unstable things are lately, having something solid under our name gives us security. Legacy, too, like Earl would have wanted." I let the spoon rest on my plate. It wasn't the first time they'd brought it up. Over the past year, Bradley had danced around the topic in subtle ways. Questions over coffee, casual remarks about property taxes, friendly concern about upkeep. I always gave the same answer: "I'm not ready." That night, I said it again, calm, even, looking him in the eye. Bradley smiled, not a forced smile, a warm one. He nodded and squeezed my hand gently. "Of course, Mum. I get it. I really do." And for a moment, I believed him. When I got home that night, I went to my desk drawer where I kept my files. I opened the folder marked Legacy, written in all caps with a faded black marker. Inside were the scanned copies of Earl's original land documents, the insurance papers, my handwritten trust notes, and a list of people who were never supposed to have access to any of it. Bradley's name had been on that list for the past 3 years. I'd added it after the first time he suggested selling part of the land to pay off credit cards Cameron had run up. He said it in passing, but the way his eyes stayed just a second too long on the table made something shift inside me. Still, after all these years, part of me wanted to believe he'd grown, that he was learning to choose legacy over leverage. That night, when I closed the folder, I placed it back in the drawer and turned the lock. I stared at the key in my hand for a few seconds, then placed it in the ceramic bowl by the kitchen sink. The next morning, my phone buzzed. A calendar reminder flashed. "Property tax renewal due next month." I smiled wryly. Bradley knew. He always did his research. In the afternoon, I went for a walk to clear my head. My legs moved slow but steady, the sun warm on my arms. I passed the little used bookstore on 7th, the one where Earl once picked up a map of American railroads, just because it reminded him of his father. When I came back home, something felt different. There was no sound, no smell of dinner, no warmth in the room. It was just me, and a silence that felt like a warning. I sat at the table. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it, that families talk about property, that it was normal, that I wasn't being played again. But in my chest, I felt a shift, a slow, growing weight. It wasn't fear yet, but it wasn't the comfort either. And later that night, when the phone buzzed again, I felt it. The faint echo of something I couldn't name yet. Not then, but soon. I would. It happened at 10:17 p.m. I was sitting in the living room, the television volume turned low, one lamp lit in the corner. I hadn't been able to sleep, and instead of lying in bed tossing around with a restless mind, I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat in my usual chair. I remember the way the steam curled over the rim of the mug. I remember the silence. And then my phone lit up on the coffee table. It wasn't a call, just a single notification. I leaned forward slowly and tapped the screen. Bank alert. Large transaction. The words blurred together for a moment. I blinked. Account ending in 34221. Withdrawal, $510,000. Balance, negative $213. I held the phone in both hands, reading it again and again. At first, my brain refused to process it. My breathing slowed. I wasn't panicking. Not yet. I was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then the second notification arrived. A message. Short. No punctuation. No name. Thank you for the 800-acre ranch. My throat went dry. I stood up without realizing it. My tea sloshed over the rim and onto my hand. I didn't even feel the heat. I walked to the kitchen, phone still clutched tight, opened the drawer with shaking fingers, and reached for the folder labeled Legacy. It wasn't there. The drawer was still locked, the key still in the bowl. No signs of forced entry, but the folder was missing. I opened the adjacent cabinet, checked behind the cookbooks, pulled out every envelope and paperclip. Nothing. I moved to the living room, unzipped the cushion I sometimes used to hide spare documents. Still nothing. The folder wasn't just gone. It had been taken, and not just by anyone. It had to be someone who knew where I kept it. Someone who had been in this house. Someone I trusted enough to leave alone in this room. My hands trembled as I sat down again, the silence pressing hard around me. My mind raced through faces. There weren't many. I lived a quiet life. Didn't host. Didn't mingle. But Bradley had come by 3 weeks ago to help set up my new printer. Cameron had stayed in the car. She said she had work emails to finish. He'd been in the house for 2 hours, alone in this very room, while I'd taken a call from Mira in the bedroom. That was the only time. I opened my contacts and tapped Gwen's name. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was alert, even though it was late. I told her, flat, no emotion, just the facts. The money's gone, $500,000. The ranch, too. I just got a message. The file's missing. There was a pause on the other end. Then, calm but firm, she said she'd be at my place in 20 minutes. While I waited, I went to the desk in the corner of the living room, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a tiny black box with a USB drive inside. I plugged it into my laptop. 2 years ago, Gwen had warned me about scenarios like this. She said, Yvonne, you need to think like an auditor again, not like a mother. I didn't want to believe that advice would ever be necessary, but I had listened. I'd made digital backups of every deed, every trust document, every signed statement from Earl, and every copy had a watermark that couldn't be removed without access to a private password, a password only Gwen and I shared. When Gwen arrived, she looked tired but sharp. She wore a coat over sweatpants, her hair pulled back in a bun, eyes already scanning the room. She didn't ask for tea. She sat beside me on the couch, opened her laptop, and asked for my login to the bank. We looked through the activity. The withdrawal had been made via transfer to an external account. The name listed on the receiving end wasn't Bradley's. It was a Shell LLC, one I didn't recognize. But Gwen did. It had been registered 4 months ago in Nevada. She traced the articles of incorporation, a fake address. But the email contact was linked to Cameron's business license for her candle venture. We stared at each other for a long moment. So it wasn't just Bradley. Cameron was the architect. The documents weren't stolen and forged in desperation. This had been planned. Quietly, carefully. Built over months. Designed to look like a natural transfer of wealth, just in case anyone ever asked. Gwen kept typing, checking property records. Then she stopped. Her voice was low. The ranch title was officially transferred 4 days ago, filed electronically, with a digital signature. Mine. I stood up slowly and walked to the window. My breath fogged the glass. The lights from the street cast long shadows into my living room. I remembered the night of Bradley's dinner invitation, the way he'd held my hand, the softness in his voice, the warmth in his eyes. All of it felt like smoke now, just a carefully rehearsed illusion. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the window pane. For a long time, I said nothing. Then I turned back to Gwen. "We're not calling him," I said. "Not yet." She nodded. "I want to see what he does next, and then we'll decide what to do with the truth." The night Gwen uncovered Cameron's name tied to the shell company, I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw anything. I just sat there with my back straight and my hands folded in my lap. Inside, something that had been holding on finally let go. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the dark hours pass, then the light slowly return across the floorboards. It wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was the weight of memory. You see, this wasn't the first time someone I loved twisted something precious into a tool for leverage. Years ago, after Earl passed, I made the mistake of assuming our son would grieve with me, that we'd both feel the loss as deeply, that we'd take care of what Earl left behind, like a shared promise. But in those months after the funeral, while I was still trying to breathe through the quiet of an empty house, Bradley was already talking to lawyers. I found out through a clerk at the courthouse that he'd tried to dispute the terms of the will, said it was unfair that the ranch was solely under my name, claimed mental distress, lack of clarity, even suggested that Earl had been coerced. He never said those words to me directly, never even admitted he'd done it. But I saw the filings. I read the statements. That was the first betrayal. I didn't confront him. I didn't disown him. I did what women like me were raised to do. I carried it in silence. I adjusted the trust paperwork to seal off access and told myself it was done. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness. He'd grow out of it. Years passed. We had birthdays, holidays, dinners. I helped them with the down payment on their house when Cameron got pregnant. I offered to babysit when Mira was born. I was there when she started school. I played the part, hoping something in him would shift. But I never forgot what he'd tried to do. That memory came back to me clearly that morning, as I sat by the window with a legal pad and began writing down everything I remembered from the past year. Every time Bradley brought up the land, every time Cameron changed the subject, every odd look, every convenient moment they dropped by when I was out. Gwen arrived again at 10. She brought coffee and a flash drive. She had already filed a preliminary fraud claim and opened a request for injunction to pause any further transfer of the ranch. But she warned me it would be hard to undo. The transaction had gone through with documents that appeared legally sound. It would take time and strategy. I told her I was ready. But what I didn't tell her yet was that this wasn't just about the land. It was about reclaiming something in myself. After she left, I went upstairs, opened the cedar chest I kept at the back of my closet. Inside were letters, some from Earl, some from Mira when she was a child, some I had written to myself. One of them was dated 5 years ago. It was the night I rewrote my will after the first betrayal. I'd forgotten what I wrote until I unfolded the paper and saw it again in my own shaky cursive. I wrote that trust is not something you hand out of habit. It is something you grant with care. And once broken, even love must earn its place again. Reading that, I realized how long I had been giving without asking, protecting without boundaries, hoping without reason. I closed the chest and stood quietly in the closet's dim light. Later that week, Mira called. She said she wanted to come visit. I hesitated, then said yes. When she arrived, she didn't bring Cameron or Bradley, just herself and a small backpack. She looked tired, paler than usual, her hair pulled into a bun that had clearly been redone in a car mirror. We sat in the kitchen. She didn't touch her tea. She said softly that she had overheard something she wasn't supposed to. A conversation between her parents, about accounts, about me, about how they expected me to give it all up soon. I didn't speak. I waited. Mira looked at me and said, "I don't think I know who they are anymore." I nodded. My hand found hers. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding on for her sake. I felt like she was choosing to hold mine. That night, after she went to bed in the guest room, I went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. I thought about legacy, not the land, not the money, but the legacy of silence. How many years I had held my tongue for peace. How many times I had taught Mira to do the same. And I realized I was done. Done hoping they'd change on their own. Done pretending things weren't broken. Done playing the patient mother, the quiet widow, the silent backbone. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and wrote down a name. Not Bradley's, Mira's. Then underneath, I wrote one line. If everything burns, let it be the silence first. Let it be the lie that love must come without limits. And then I slept. For the first time in 3 days, I slept through the night. 3 days later, I received an invitation. Bradley had planned a family dinner. It was written in that crisp tone he always used when he wanted to pretend everything was fine. The message said they were cooking something special, and Cameron would make her lemon pie, the one I used to love. Mira was already staying with me, and she saw the message too. She looked at me and didn't say a word. Neither did I. But I went. Not because I wanted reconciliation, not because I was looking for another lie wrapped in a smile. I went because I needed to see it. The room, the faces, the dynamic they thought I was still blind to. I dressed simply, soft beige blouse, flats, no jewelry. Mira came with me but said she'd walk around the block once we got there. She didn't want to be in that house if things went sideways. When Cameron opened the door, her expression flickered. Just for a second. Then the polished charm took over. She said I looked well, complimented my hair, told me to come in. Bradley was in the kitchen. He had wine in hand and music playing low in the background. Nora Jones, soft and smooth, like it was any other evening. I sat at the table and the food came out. Chicken stuffed with spinach and goat cheese, roasted vegetables, wine poured into my glass before I could wave it off. They tried to pull me into easy conversation. I gave them quiet smiles. What I didn't say was that Gwen had already filed a request for a forensic audit, that she was working with a friend who used to work for the state attorney's office, that the trail they left behind, though subtle, wasn't invisible. What I didn't say was that the new digital signature system they used had a logging mechanism. Every time a file was opened, accessed, forwarded, timestamps, IP addresses, it was all there, and it all led back to Cameron's device. What I didn't say was that the transfer of funds had been flagged by the bank's internal fraud team, that Sandra had submitted a formal report to their compliance office, that I had sat with her in her glass office just that morning, watching her hands tremble with restrained fury. She had known me too long to stay neutral. Instead, I cut my food into small bites and listened, as Bradley talked about how fast the seasons were changing. He said the ranch had already started its fall bloom, the scrub grass turning gold. He said it like it still belonged to us. I let him talk. I let Cameron clear plates and pour more wine. But underneath the table, my hands were clenched. The ache didn't come from betrayal anymore. That part had hardened. It was the performance, the arrogance of pretending I wouldn't notice, that I was too old, too tired, too soft to fight back. After dessert, Bradley said he had something to show me. He pulled out his phone and opened a document. It was a proposal, a vineyard plan, grapevines, irrigation, labor projections. He said they had already met with a consultant who promised big returns in 5 years. All they needed was an investor. He smiled and said, "We were hoping you'd be involved, as the matriarch." I looked at the screen. The plan had a watermark, Cameron's LLC, the same one Gwen had traced. I handed the phone back without a word. Bradley's face stayed pleasant, but his eyes watched me carefully, waiting. Cameron walked in from the kitchen and placed a hand on his shoulder. She smiled too, that tightly drawn smile that never reached her eyes. I stood up, thanked them for dinner, said the pie was good. Bradley walked me to the door. Cameron stayed behind. Just as I was stepping outside, he placed his hand lightly on my back and said, "You've always been the heart of this family." I turned to him, holding his gaze. I said, "Sometimes the heart has to stop beating for the rest of the body to realize it can't survive without it." Then I walked out into the cool night air. Mira was waiting by the car. She didn't speak, just opened the door and let me in. On the ride home, I looked out the window at the streetlights stretching ahead. Something inside me felt quieter now, not calmer, just clearer. Back home, I sat at my desk again. I opened the folder Gwen had updated and read through the latest documents. They had submitted a fraud affidavit, requested an injunction against property development, and triggered a clause in the estate plan that would freeze all legal actions pending review. It wasn't war yet, but it was movement, and I had started it. I knew there would be consequences. Bradley wouldn't stay quiet. Cameron would panic. But I also knew that for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. The next morning I made a list. Names, dates, documents. I was preparing not just for battle, but for rebuilding. Mira came into the kitchen and poured coffee into my cup without asking. She sat across from me, no makeup, sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder. She said, "Whatever comes, I've got you." I looked at her and nodded. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't afraid of losing anymore. I had already lost the illusion of family. What was left now was truth, and I could live with that. By the end of that week, the veneer started to crack. Gwen called early Friday morning. Her voice was sharper than usual, laced with restrained tension. She told me to check my inbox immediately. I opened the email and found a series of PDFs labeled Internal Audit Findings. It was from the regional bank's fraud department. Sandra, the woman I had known for over 20 years, had escalated my report into a full investigation. What they found wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate construction. The transfer of $510,000 had originated from an IP address tied to a secondary login, created under my name, but registered from a residential router in Rio Rancho, Cameron and Bradley's address. They had used my name to open a shadow profile and mirror my digital signature. The transfer was split into two accounts under Cameron's LLC, then funneled through another shell company registered in Wyoming, each step carefully timed, almost elegant in a twisted way. But they had made one mistake. One of the documents they submitted to finalize the electronic deed transfer used an outdated version of my signature, one that had been replaced years ago when Gwen helped me file new paperwork after Earl died. The outdated signature wasn't legally binding. It became the thread Gwen needed to start pulling. I printed every file. Page by page, I laid them out across the dining table. Each printout, each timestamp, each routing number. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just stood there, looking at the map of betrayal in plain black ink. That evening, Gwen came over. We sat side by side in the same room where Bradley once watched cartoons on the carpet while Earl napped with a book on his chest. Gwen laid out the strategy. First, freeze the accounts under Cameron's LLC through an emergency petition. Next, notify the registrar's office that the deed may be invalid due to fraudulent authorization. Then, notify the county assessor and place a hold on all changes to the property's tax status. Finally, she said quietly, we will have to file for a formal civil suit, not just fraud. Conversion, forgery, breach of fiduciary trust. My name would be public, so would theirs. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. Not because I wanted revenge, but because silence had protected them long enough. It was time to break the cycle. The next day, a courier arrived with a formal response letter from Bradley's lawyer. It was written with the same sterile professionalism he had once used to dispute Earl's will. The letter denied all wrongdoing. It claimed I had authorized the transfer in good faith, that Cameron had only acted to protect the family estate, that I had misunderstood. I read it twice, then set it aside. Gwen drafted the first legal response, and I signed it that evening. 2 days later, I received a voicemail. It was Cameron. Her voice trembled slightly as she said she was confused, that this wasn't the way to handle a family disagreement, that we needed to talk like adults. I didn't call back. Instead, I went to the ranch. I hadn't been there since spring. The gravel crackled under my tires. The porch still held Earl's old rocking chair. The barn had been painted a dull grey, not the warm rust colour we'd always used. Inside, it smelled different. Bradley had moved in some furniture. I could see the outlines of new carpet against the old wood. The kitchen held mismatched dishes. And yet, even with all the signs of someone trying to make it theirs, the place didn't feel like home. I stood in the middle of the living room and closed my eyes. This was where Earl had told me about his diagnosis, where we had our last Christmas with both grandkids, where we buried the old dog behind the elm tree and cried like children. The walls didn't just hold memories, they held intention. And now, they held a breach. That night, I wrote a letter, not for court, not for Gwen, for Mira. I told her the truth, the real truth, not just what Bradley and Cameron had done, but what I had allowed, how I had chosen peace over boundaries, how I had taught her, through quiet compliance, that love meant giving everything, even when it hurt. I told her I was sorry, and I told her I was done. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the desk drawer in the guest room she always used. The following morning, Gwen informed me that the injunction had been approved. The bank accounts were officially frozen. The title on the ranch was placed under review. Nothing could be sold, developed, or transferred. It was the first real stop in a long road ahead. That afternoon, I stood outside and looked at my garden. It was overgrown, wild. But I didn't feel defeated. I felt rooted. The wind moved through the trees with a soft rhythm. Mira walked out to join me, her steps quiet. She didn't ask anything, just stood beside me and looked out. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not because the storm had passed, but because I had finally stopped pretending it wasn't coming. The silence didn't last long. By the second week after the injunction was granted, I began to feel it, an undercurrent of agitation circling the house. It didn't come from Mira. She had been a quiet presence, respectful, careful, often brewing tea without asking and offering it in silence. But the calls from Bradley had resumed. This time, he didn't leave voicemails. He let the phone ring twice and hang up, the same hour, each night. Then came the letter, delivered by courier again, with my name written in cursive. I didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, handwritten, not by Cameron, not by a lawyer. It was Bradley. He didn't address me as Mom. He simply wrote my name, Yvonne. The letter was an attempt at something resembling apology, but not quite. He said he didn't know the transfer had gone through that way, that he didn't mean for the situation to get so complicated, that Cameron had been the one pushing to expand, to invest, that he had trusted her. He said he missed how things used to be, that Mira didn't answer his calls anymore, that it felt like everything was falling apart. He didn't mention the ranch, or the money. I read it 3 times. I placed it back into the envelope and slid it into the drawer where I kept expired warranties and old tax returns. Then I walked outside. The sun had started its slow descent behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the yard. The air had that early autumn edge, crisp enough to wake something inside you. I sat on the steps of the porch, my sweater pulled tight, and watched the day change. I thought about Earl. I thought about how he would have handled this, whether he would have confronted Bradley head-on, whether he would have warned me not to soften, or whether, like me, he would have hoped, too long, for their character to bloom late. Gwen called just after dark. She had news. The registrar had officially flagged the deed to the ranch as contested. No sales, development, or refinancing could take place until the dispute was settled. Meanwhile, the LLC linked to Cameron was being reviewed for suspected misuse of inheritance assets. Gwen's contact at the state level had quietly begun an ethics review. Things were moving. And yet I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Because it wasn't only about restitution, it was about recognition. Later that week, Mira walked into the living room with a box in her hands. A shoebox, one of mine. She found it in the attic while looking for fall decorations. Inside were photographs, old ones, of Bradley as a boy, of Earl building the fence line by hand, of me, younger, wearing denim and holding a clipboard. We sat together on the couch and flipped through them. Mira paused on one where she was a toddler, cradled in my arms at the front gate of the ranch. I looked tired but peaceful. She said she didn't remember that day, but she remembered the way the air smelled, the mix of hay and pine. She said it used to make her feel safe. I nodded, my eyes still on the photo. That was before everything got complicated, I said. But it was never simple, was it? The next morning, Bradley showed up. He didn't call ahead. He didn't ask. I heard the car pull in and saw him through the kitchen window. Mira was in the backyard, watering the late-season kale. I told her to stay put. When I opened the door, he was already halfway up the steps. His face looked older than it had weeks ago, drawn, jaw tight. He held a folder in one hand. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. He didn't reach for a hug. He said he wanted to talk, that he had documents to show me, that he wanted to explain. I told him I didn't need explanations. I needed accountability. His mouth twitched. He said Cameron had panicked, that the investment consultant had warned them about rising property taxes, that they thought if they didn't move fast, they'd lose the land to creditors. I reminded him there were no creditors. He shifted his weight, said they'd been told otherwise, that the pressure had gotten to them, that they were trying to think like visionaries, like builders, that this was all about legacy. I asked him whose legacy he thought he was building. He didn't answer. He handed me the folder. Inside were bank statements, wire confirmations. A document Cameron had signed transferring her shares of the LLC to someone else. He said she was distancing herself, said she didn't want to be involved anymore. I closed the folder. I told him the house was not open to him, that Mira lived here now, that her safety, her trust, her presence mattered more than pretending we were still a family in the way he wanted to present it. He nodded, almost respectfully. But as he turned to leave, I saw it. Not regret, fear. Because somewhere deep down, he finally understood that this wasn't about the ranch anymore. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about fraud. It was about exile, self-inflicted exile. That night, I didn't open the folder again. I didn't need to read through every line. I had seen everything I needed to see. The look in his eyes as he turned away told me more than 1,000 apologies ever could. He thought he could lose a mother and still win the world. But the world he built had no soil, no roots, and no way back. The days grew shorter. The trees outside the house began to shed their leaves in quiet spirals, blanketing the yard in gold and rust. There was something oddly peaceful about it, not because things were settled, but because the air no longer carried the weight of pretense. Bradley didn't come back. Cameron stayed silent. What arrived instead was a letter from their attorney, this time with more careful wording. It stated they were willing to consider mediation, that in the spirit of family, both parties should explore resolution outside of court, that what had occurred could be addressed through restructured ownership and adjusted oversight. I didn't need Gwen to translate. The message was clear. They were afraid. I placed the letter in the same drawer where I kept Bradley's last note. The drawer was beginning to feel like a mausoleum for failed intentions. But I wasn't interested in mausoleums anymore. I wanted growth, not the manicured kind that Cameron had promised with her vineyard pitch. Real growth, the kind that comes from decay, from letting things rot long enough to nourish something honest. That week, Gwen and I met twice. The forensic review had concluded. The evidence was strong. The estate planning attorney who had helped me update my trust 5 years ago had submitted a statement verifying my signature records. Combined with the bank's internal report and the county registrar's findings, the fraud case had legs. Legal legs. Solid ones. But Gwen also reminded me of something else. Power is not just in what you can prove, it's in what you choose to do with it. She asked if I wanted to proceed with the civil lawsuit. I told her I needed the weekend. Not to think, to write. So I sat at the kitchen table, the one with the water rings from years of family meals, and began to draft a letter. Not to Gwen, not to the judge, to Bradley. But this time, not out of anger, out of clarity. I didn't start with accusations. I began with memories. The day he lost his first tooth, the time he tried to climb the windmill and scraped half his arm raw, the summer he refused to leave Earl's side in the barn, following him around with a notebook and a pen because he wanted to learn how to run the place. I told him that those memories still lived in me, that no act of greed, no scheme wrapped in spreadsheets could erase them. But I also told him this, that love without respect curdles into obligation, that trust, once taken for granted, doesn't dissolve, it transforms, it becomes distance, it becomes boundaries, it becomes a locked gate with no key. I wrote that I no longer saw myself as a piece of the foundation that he could build his empire on, that I was not a silent partner in his legacy, that my silence had ended the moment I realized it was mistaken for permission. I ended the letter with a sentence I had never spoken aloud. I forgive you, not because you asked, but because I need the space where bitterness used to live. I folded the letter neatly, slid it into an envelope, but I didn't address it. I didn't mail it. I placed it in the same drawer as the others. It wasn't meant for delivery. It was meant for closure. By Sunday evening, Gwen returned with final papers. Instead of a traditional lawsuit, we initiated a restricted property trust, transferring control of the ranch into a legal foundation under my direction. That structure would protect the land from being sold or seized, even if Bradley tried to re-enter the picture. He couldn't claim ownership, couldn't apply for loans against it, couldn't even access the property without approval. Mira was named as successor trustee. Her name, inked in legal permanence, stood in contrast to the old stories still echoing around us. That night, she found me in the greenhouse, pruning the rosemary I'd forgotten to replant last year. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. The way she moved beside me, quietly filling the air with presence instead of words, reminded me that legacy isn't just land or money or names on paper. Legacy is memory passed forward without apology. Legacy is healing what others shattered. Legacy is planting something in soil you were told was poisoned and watching it rise anyway. The following morning, we drove back to the ranch, just the two of us. I hadn't stood at the gate since the injunction was finalized. The iron creaked slightly as we opened it. The earth smelled dry but ready, ready for something new. We walked the property line in silence. At one point, Mira stopped to pick up a branch and broke it in two. She handed me one half, kept the other in her hand, and said softly, "Let's mark it here." We placed the halves upright in the soil, one at each end of the north fence. No words, just intention. That evening, I lit the fireplace back home. I pulled out the box of old photographs again and began placing them into new albums, not by date, by meaning. The ranch, Mira's birth, Earl's last day in the field, my face, in different seasons. For years, I had arranged memories in chronological order as if that gave them weight. Now, I wanted to arrange them by what mattered, by what endured. The rest, I let go. I didn't shred the letters. I didn't delete the emails. But I stopped rereading them. The story had already turned, and I was writing the next chapter with hands no longer shaking. It was a Thursday night when I finally saw them again. I had just come back from the ranch, tired from reviewing the final draft of the foundation documents with Gwen. The house was quiet. Mira had driven out to visit a friend for the evening. The moonlight spilled through the living room curtains in pale streaks. I was boiling water for tea when I heard the knock. It was firm, not aggressive, but it didn't carry the rhythm of a neighbor or deliveryman. I opened the door slowly. Bradley stood there, alone. He didn't look like the man who once ran the ranch beside Earl with boyish pride. He looked older, not by age, but by erosion. His eyes carried something that wasn't regret, not quite, but maybe the weight of consequences settling into place. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside, not out of permission, but because I needed to see where this would go. We sat in the living room, across from one another, the steam from my mug rising between us like a veil. He began talking slowly, said things had been hard since Cameron left. She took the car, the accounts under her name, and the consultant's number she had been working with. Apparently, her departure wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. The LLC was collapsing, creditors were circling, and the pressure was starting to show in every corner of his life. I listened. He said he knew he had failed me, that the trust I placed in him had been shattered, that Mira's distance cut deeper than he expected, that watching his daughter call another house home forced him to see what he'd destroyed. Still, I said nothing. He handed me a sheet of paper. It was a handwritten list of all the accounts tied to Cameron's name, along with the amounts withdrawn. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted me to have everything I needed to finish whatever legal path I had started. Then he said something that lingered long after he left. He said, "You never raised your voice. That's what makes it worse." I kept waiting for the explosion, and instead, I got silence. And it was louder than anything I've ever heard. He stood and left before I could respond. I didn't follow him. I didn't tear the paper or tuck it away as evidence. I laid it flat on the table and just looked at it. For so long, my silence had been mistaken for weakness. But in that moment, I realized what it really was. A boundary. A quiet declaration that I would no longer be used to justify someone else's version of love. The next morning, I made a decision. I called Gwen and told her I was ready for the foundation to go public. She hesitated. This would mean my name, and the family's name, would be linked to the story. The ranch would no longer just be a piece of land with history. It would be a symbol of recovery, of betrayal, of reform. I said that was exactly what I wanted. So we began drafting the public statement. Not as a press release, as a founding charter, a mission of intent. The ranch would operate under a new banner, the Whitfield Women's Trust. It would serve as a resource and retreat space for women rebuilding after betrayal, abuse, financial exploitation. The land wouldn't just grow produce, it would grow dignity, recovery, future. I named Mira as co-founder. She didn't know it yet, but she would. 3 days later, I sat her down. She was folding laundry in the den. I handed her the charter, watched her eyes move across the lines. Her lips pressed together midway, her brows furrowed. When she reached the end, she looked up, eyes glossy. She asked me if I was sure. I told her I had never been more sure of anything in my life. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she hugged me, harder than I expected, and said thank you without words. That night, we made dinner together, chopped vegetables, lit a candle even though there was no special occasion. The kind of quiet celebration that doesn't announce itself but lingers in the air long after the plates are cleared. A week later, the local paper published a small feature on the trust. No names were mentioned except mine and Mira's. But people knew. The phone rang more than usual. Some calls were supportive, others cautious. A few tried to pull old wounds open. But I didn't flinch. Because I knew this wasn't about shame anymore. This was about story. Taking back the story. Not to revise the past, but to reroute the future. Later that month, I stood at the ranch again. Gwen had joined me to walk through the land with a surveyor. We talked about building a small greenhouse, converting the old storage shed into a learning space. I told her I wanted benches along the tree line, where women could sit in silence and remember that they were not alone. That afternoon, Mira walked out from the barn holding a paintbrush. She said she found Earl's old sign in the back, the one that used to say "No trespassing." She wanted to repaint it, but this time with new words. She dipped the brush into a tin of white paint, steadied her hand, and wrote 3 words across the old wood. "You belong here." I didn't cry. I just stood there, watching the letters dry in the sun, feeling something in my chest soften that I hadn't even known was still hard. Sometimes a legacy isn't something you leave behind. Sometimes it's something you build in the ashes, and you live to walk through it with your head held high. The table had always been too big. It sat in the center of the old dining room, made of thick walnut, heavy enough that it took 3 men to move it when we first bought it. Earl used to joke that we didn't buy the table, we inherited it. For decades, it had hosted birthdays, harvest feasts, school projects, even grief. That table had held every kind of silence known to a family, and now it sat unused. Until I opened the windows one morning and decided to prepare dinner, not just for me and Mira, but for those who had quietly stood with me through this storm. Sandra from the bank, the woman who could have shrugged off my case but didn't. Gwen, of course. Without her, none of this would have been possible. 2 women from the foundation board we had just finalized, both of them survivors of financial abuse and both now helping shape programming for the trust. And Mira. I cooked slowly, not out of nostalgia, but intention. Every vegetable chopped with steady hands, every pot stirred with memory and purpose. The smell filled the house before noon. By the time the first knock came, the sun was sitting low, turning the kitchen walls a faded amber. We gathered at that too big table, and for once it wasn't too big. No one spoke about Bradley, or Cameron, or the lawsuit that was still winding through the courts. We didn't need to. Their absence said everything. We spoke of land, of healing, of what it meant to be believed, even when you've spent your whole life being doubted by people who share your blood. Gwen raised her glass, not to me, but to continuity, to women who endure, to daughters who return, to futures that bloom after frost. The warmth from that evening stayed with me, long after the dishes were done and the chairs pushed back in. The next morning, I went for a walk around the perimeter of the property, alone. I hadn't done that since Earl passed. The ground was damp but not soft. Fall had taken its time this year. The trees still carried streaks of green among the brown. Birds stirred gently overhead, as if aware of something shifting in the air. Near the eastern fence, I found an envelope taped to the old gatepost. There was no name on it. Inside was a note. 2 sentences, written in uneven print. "I'm sorry. I miss her too." It wasn't signed, but I knew the handwriting. It was Bradley's. I folded the note, placed it in my coat pocket, and stood there for a long time. The apology was not for me. It was for Mira. And though it was too late to undo what had been done, it wasn't too late to recognize it. Still, I didn't reach out. Because I had learned something in these months. Healing does not require everyone to join you. Sometimes, it simply means you move forward without dragging the weight of others' silence behind you. That afternoon, I sat down with Mira. We finalized the workshop schedule for the trust. She had come up with a new idea, a weekend retreat for women over 60 who had recently experienced estrangement from children or spouses. The goal wasn't therapy, it was community. Quiet, gentle spaces to write, walk, and share meals without explanation. I looked at her while she spoke. Her hands moved like mine used to, her voice steady, her back straight. She didn't seem young anymore, not in the fragile way, but in the kind of strength that only grows after betrayal. I told her to go ahead and schedule it. 2 weeks later, our first group arrived. 7 women. One had lost her retirement savings to her son-in-law's business scheme. Another had been quietly written out of her husband's will after 42 years of marriage. One had been forced into a care home by her daughter, only to escape and start over at 75. They sat at the long table, not to complain, but to breathe, to exist without proving their worth, to look one another in the eye and see reflections instead of failures. We served soup that night, homemade bread, chamomile tea, and for the first time, that table held not just memory, but momentum, the kind of momentum that does not shout. It whispers, it anchors, it reminds. I stepped outside for a moment while they laughed inside. I looked at the stars. No moon that night, just clear sky and wind, and then footsteps behind me. It was Mira. She handed me the old wooden sign from the ranch. She had sanded off the words, said it was time to let it go. I looked down at the bare wood. For the first time, it felt light. We placed it by the fence near the herb garden, not as a warning, as a marker, a reminder of where we had been and how far we had come. The morning started like any other. The fog hung low across the pasture, curling around the tree line like a secret. Mira was already outside, checking the compost barrels. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching her move with ease, her boots leaving a trail through the dew. There was a calmness to it all. But beneath that calm, I knew the hearing was scheduled for tomorrow. Months of filings, counters, and legal back and forth had led to this moment. Gwen had warned me not to expect fireworks. It was a probate matter, not a courtroom drama. But that didn't mean it lacked weight. The judge would review the full findings: fraudulent signatures, the false LLC ownership structure, Cameron's silent exit, and Bradley's partial cooperation. It would all be laid bare, not for revenge, but for clarity. I sat at the table with Gwen that afternoon to go over the documents one last time. She slid a thick folder across to me and placed a yellow tag on the page titled Reallocation of Estate-Based Holdings. Under that, my name appeared again, this time not just as a trustee, but as a restored legal heir. I ran my hand over the paper. The texture felt familiar and foreign all at once. "You're back where you always belonged," Gwen said. But it didn't feel like going back. It felt like walking forward on land I'd once lost in the fog. That night, Mira made lentil stew. We ate in comfortable silence. After dinner, I stepped outside and walked to the far edge of the property, past the apple trees and toward the fence where Mira had placed the old wooden board, the one we had sanded clean. It stood now without any inscription, and that was the point. It no longer needed words to explain what had changed. It simply marked where something had ended, and something else had begun. I stood there a long while, and when I returned inside, I slept without dreams. The next morning I dressed simply. No dramatic outfit, no statement jewelry, just navy slacks, a blouse, and Earl's old watch on my wrist. Mira offered to come, but I asked her to stay. I needed this part of the journey to be mine. The courthouse was quiet, clean, almost sterile in its symmetry. Gwen and I sat together at the long wooden bench while the clerk reviewed final exhibits. Bradley was already inside, alone. He didn't look at me when I entered. Cameron did not attend. The judge was efficient, direct. She asked questions. Gwen answered clearly. The findings spoke for themselves. No protest came from Bradley's side. Only acknowledgement. When it was over, the judge signed the ruling and said the final transfer would be recorded that week. All prior fraudulent transactions would be reversed. My name restored. The trust officially protected. End of matter. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I thanked the judge, turned toward the door, and walked out. Bradley followed me down the hall but kept his distance. In the parking lot, he called my name. I turned. He stood there with his hands in his pockets. He said nothing. So I did. I told him I hoped he would heal, that healing had nothing to do with winning or keeping. It had to do with facing what he ran from. I didn't offer a hug. I didn't soften. I just stood there, as myself. Whole. Unbent. Then I turned and left. The ride home was quiet. Gwen didn't fill the silence, and I didn't ask her to. She knew. There are victories that don't feel like triumph. They feel like release. When I arrived, Mira was pruning the rosemary again. She looked up, saw my face, and nodded, no words needed. We walked the field together that evening. I told her what had happened. She smiled, picked a thistle from the path, and handed it to me. "It's rough," she said, "but it holds strong." I held it in my hand, thinking about what we hold and what we finally let go. That night, I placed Earl's watch back into the drawer where I kept old photos. I closed it gently. Then I sat at the kitchen table, pulled out a blank page, and began writing again. Not a statement, not a letter, just a memory. One that belonged to me, and no one else. One that I wouldn't let time, betrayal, or courts rewrite. What we reclaim is never just property. It's the quiet right to tell our own story, and to stand in the middle of it, unashamed. It had rained the night before, soft, slow drops that tapped against the roof like old lullabies. By morning the sky had cleared, and the air smelled of wet earth and eucalyptus. I opened every window in the house. Mira was already in the kitchen, setting out jars of preserves we had prepared weeks ago. The pantry was full. The soil was tilled. The house felt lived in again, not just occupied. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next blow. I wasn't walking on glass, wasn't listening for a door to slam or a voice to raise. There was nothing left to take from me. What mattered, I had reclaimed. Not in a courtroom, not in dollars, but in the way I now held space for myself. A delivery truck arrived around 10. They brought in wooden chairs for the retreat program, each handmade by a local woman whose workshop the trust had helped fund. Mira and I carried them in, one by one. My back ached by the 5th trip, but I didn't mind. Pain from work was different than pain from silence. This pain, at least, had purpose. After lunch, I walked down to the pasture alone. The sun hung low, casting gold on every blade of grass. I followed the trail we'd created months ago, past the fig trees, around the bend where we planted lavender. I stopped at the hilltop and looked down at the house. It didn't look like the place where betrayal lived anymore. It looked like home. I sat on the bench near the gatepost, the same one Mira and I placed when we sanded off the old sign. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the last note I had written but never sent, the one to myself. It read, "You were never lost. You were only waiting to be remembered by your own heart." I folded it again and tucked it under the bench, let the wind take it if it wanted. Later that evening, Mira lit a candle by the windowsill. She didn't say much, just smiled and poured me a cup of tea. Outside, dusk settled like a soft blanket. No shouting, no phones ringing, no second guessing, just stillness. And it wasn't empty. It was full of breath, of memory, of the small, radical act of staying. Not because someone asked, but because I chose it. This land, this life, this chapter, not defined by what was taken, but by what I now protect, and finally what I grow. If you've ever felt invisible in your own story, If you've quietly rebuilt yourself after being torn down by those you once trusted, maybe you saw a part of yourself in mine. This isn't just a story about a ranch, it's about reclaiming voice, space, and worth. If it spoke to something inside you, I'd love to hear. Your story matters too. Thank you for walking this path with me, even if just for a while. I'm grateful you stayed.